As part of my character assassination, well deserved, of Winston Churchill, I will now look at the role of America in the war. The people of the so-called arsenal of democracy are very happy to brag about their role in the war with little justification. So consider this a thank you. The Americans stayed out of the war for as long as they could, of course, and offered very little help to the Allies and considerably more to the Axis. The Holocaust could only operate with IBM census machines. The Nazis' trucks were made by GM and Ford. Long before the war proper started, the Nazis' proxy war in Spain was also aided by the Americans. As soon as the coup was attempted by Franco and his gang of African mercenaries, the American oil companies rerouted their shipments to ports controlled by the revolutionaries and away from the democratically elected government. When the war started, they were happy to sell to anyone, although the Nazis couldn't smuggle shipments past the Royal Navy. Of course, they created the Lend-Lease Act, in the same way a loan shark is only too happy to lend money up front. This first allowed 100 obsolete destroyers to be transferred to the Royal Navy for a premium fee, to be paid on the Never Never. Unfortunately, most of these were utterly useless and could never be brought back into service. Those which were brought back into service still took so long they were effectively no use. So a handful of obsolete ships when they were no longer needed, for the price of 100 at a premium rate. The Lend-Lease program continued to be far more used to the American economic agenda than to the war effort. Britain was required to transfer most of her gold reserves to the Americans, ironically via destroyers that actually worked. Imperial trade tariffs were required to be lowered for American goods. British overseas investments were required to be liquidated. And that is just to attain the Lend-Lease agreement. Under the terms of reverse Lend-Lease, Britain was also to supply America with raw materials and with all British wartime inventions and the right to exploit those inventions commercially. The only reason the Manhattan Project was able to develop a nuclear bomb was because of Britain scientists transferred from the British program tube alloys. Tube alloys had to be shut down because no uranium was available, as the entire Canadian supply had been taken by the Americans under reverse Lend-Lease. And of course, after the war the Americans refused to share any nuclear information with Britain, although their citizens obligingly provided such information to the Soviets. And all for the privilege of standing alone against tyranny. The war eventually ended, and the Americans also think they have something to be proud of after that: the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a naked grab for political power. A requirement was that communists not be allowed into government. The French government at that time was a coalition led by de Gaulle, but including the communists, who had been among the most effective resistance groups against the Nazis. The communists were booted out of government to allow Marshall aid to be received. In Italy the election was rigged by the nascent CIA, with the help of the collaborating Pope. In Belgium the head of the Socialist Party, and leader of the wartime resistance, was murdered. As for the amount of the Marshall Plan, although it's true that Britain received more in Marshall aid than Germany did, it's also true that none of Britain's debts under Lend-Lease were cancelled after the war. The Germans were left with no debts and no need to pay compensation for their attempt to conquer the world. The Soviets, who had used their Lend-Lease arrangements to set themselves up for post-war recovery rather than continuing the war, had their debts forgiven. Britain had to pay her debts. The Germans made a profit on the war, in other words over 1,000 million in Marshall aid and no debts left over. Britain was left with thousands of millions of debt after Marshall aid. In addition, a loan was given to the British government to keep them solvent after the war. One of the terms of that loan was to allow pounds to be freely convertible into dollars. That, obviously, immediately and catastrophically weakened the pound, and almost the entire loan was gone within a month on propping up the currency, at which point convertibility was suspended. Too late, of course. Britain rebuilt, retooled for civilian production, but her inventions were exploited by the Americans instead and her markets colonized. The aim of all this was for America to replace Britain as the world's leading power and to take over economic power from Britain even in the British Empire. And, of course, it worked. It made Britain the sick man of Europe for decades to come, and the debts were still being repaid even into the 21st century. The Americans were never eager to fight the Nazis, but they obtained their first victory over Britain, and it was decisive. And it was Churchill who was stupid enough to negotiate most of it.